Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to see such a good crowd today. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Chandra Orrill, who is an IU alum from the Instructional Systems Technology Program. And
There is one for your PhD.
and she graduated just a few years ago.
Just
I've known Chandra since she was a grad student. We're trying to remember exactly when, and we think it had something to do with Tom.
It certainly has something to do with Tom.
But yeah, details are foggy because it's been
Just a couple years.
Just a couple years, yes. Chandra is the executive director of the Rethink Learning Lab. She's a math educator with a background in instructional technology. Before she joined Rethink Learning Lab, Chandra was a professor at UMass Dartmouth, as well as director of the Caput Center for Research and Innovation in STEM Education. And as we do the CRLT speakers series, we try to have a mix of people who are in formal and or academic and non-academic kind of appointments. So Chandra probably has some insight into both of those kinds of settings. She is passionate about working with teachers to create inquiry-oriented, technology-based and discussion-oriented learning spaces for mathematics and computational thinking. She's published both in Math Ed and in the Learning Sciences, and is still on the editorial board at Journal of Learning Sciences. So I think she bridges across several disciplines in the school, and without me talking too much, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for coming. We can get a chair over there, Eric. It is super delightful to be back here. IU is one of my favorite places on earth. It always has been. And so I'm super excited to be here and to share my work with you. I'm going to try to merge together computational thinking and the teacher professional development work I do, which is going to open it up for questions in all kinds of different directions. But I'm also happy to answer questions about being on the tenure track in academia, being not on the tenure track in academia, and being out of academia, because I have done all three. The work I'm going to talk about today is funded by the National Science Foundation. I am partnered with Penn State Abington and the University of Georgia. I could not do this work alone, so I have my team listed there. And while James Burke is no longer on my team because he's graduated, he is a huge part of the work that's here. So I wanted to acknowledge him as well. So to help you understand where I'm coming from in this presentation, I got a PhD in instructional systems technology. I moved to Georgia, became a math educator, spent 9.5 years there as a research scientist, not on the tenure track. Then went to UMass Dartmouth and climbed the tenure line from assistant to full professor. And now I've been the executive director of research and development at Rethink Learning Labs for 7 months. Rethink Learning Labs is a nonprofit that is dedicated to transforming schools through research. So bringing research to practice in schools. My research areas, I kind of have 2 research areas going. They fundamentally end up landing around teacher knowledge. So the line that's been going the longest is how teachers understand the mathematics they teach, how to assess that, how to create materials to help teachers learn math better. But I also have a line of research going around computational thinking and using it to teach math in the elementary grades. I'm also doing a little bit of work with cybersecurity, so I cross over into the computer science realm a little bit. So when I saw the title of the series, the CRLT series for the year, I decided that I was going to challenge myself to wrap my math professional development work into thinking about going beyond accessing computer science education. And I'm going to offer the work that I'm doing as a case study of ways that we could think about moving beyond simply cognitive computer science education to thinking about situated framing. So Kafai and Proctor published this paper in Ed Researcher in 2021, outlining moving beyond just thinking about cognition in computer science education. Computer science education is still largely owned by the computer science world. It's not really owned in education yet. And the computer science world doesn't have as many theories to work with as we do because they're not educators. That's not their job. But it is our job. And so we have a lot more theories to work with, and Kafai and Proctor are making that point that we have these different lenses that we could be thinking through how to bring people into the world of computer science. We don't have to just focus on teaching them to code. There are other things we could be teaching them. There's other ways we could be teaching them. And I would argue that math education is a lot the same way. We spend so much time in math education talking about skills, building skills, testing skills. Not so much in the math ed research world. The math ed research world doesn't look like that at all, but that's what the schools look like. And we could move into the situated framing with math ed just as easily. So I'm going to offer our professional development as an example of situated framing of math ed and think about how could it translate back into computer science education. The critical framing, I think, is very interesting. And I think that math education has a lot to offer there too as well, but that's not where my work sits. My work sits more in the situated framing. So the sort of parallel in math to the Kafai organization is thinking about the functionality of technology in math education. Divers and his colleagues developed a very simple heuristic for thinking about it. And I think we spend too much time up here. Like if you think about all of the math programs that you see sitting in schools, it's all practice, 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 individualized instruction for practice. It's, you know, it's been like that for years. Gamification will make it better, but it's still practice. I'm saying let's play down here with our technology in the developed concepts arena. So a quick overview. I'm going to talk about the lenses that we look at our work through so that you can understand where we're coming from. I'm going to talk about the noticing that caused this entire program to exist, define Playful PD. I'm going to give you a sample of what it looks like, and then I'm going to tie it back to computer science education. So where we're coming from is the design-based research world. We are doing multiple iterations. We are building both theory and innovations that embody that theory, both in terms of the kind of math curriculum that we're writing for teachers and in terms of the tools that we're using. And we're looking at teacher learning from a perspective of knowledge in pieces, which says that understanding is made of fine-grained understanding that we call knowledge resources. And that PD provides opportunities for developing connections between knowledge resources as well as building knowledge resources. So an example from the design-based research piece, just so you can kind of see how design-based research fits into this. When we did our pilot for this professional development, we had an assertion that teachers needed to learn some math. So they need to explore so that they can understand the math that they teach. This math is proportions. At the pilot stage, it was only proportions. Now it's proportions and fractions. So they'll explore the math, they'll test conjectures, they'll do sense making, they'll do mathematical argumentation. And then we'll give them time to think about how to apply it to their classroom so that they will feel like their time spent with us was worthwhile. Seems very straightforward. Turns out teachers couldn't make this jump. It was too big for them because we were using non-standard representations over here and they didn't understand how it tied into their classroom. So they loved this. They loved thinking about how they could use this in their classroom, but they couldn't think about how to use this in their classroom in ways that met the standards that they have to teach. And unfortunately, the reality of classrooms right now is if it doesn't meet the standards you have to teach, you're not going to teach it. That's just how that works. So the fact that they couldn't see how they could take it with their standards and make it work was a problem. So when we created the next iteration, we refined our theory, which is part of the design-based research here. We've added a connect phase. And the whole purpose of the connect phase is to help them go from the experience they're having as math learners to the experience we want them to create as math teachers. And in the connect phase, we give them a chance to use more traditional representations, paper and pencil representations instead of technology-based. We give them a chance to think about how it connects to their standards. And part of the current research is looking at, does this need to be a part of the classroom conversation or does this need to be reflection? So we have two different conditions going on. One group of people gets reflective connection activities and another group of people gets classroom conversation kinds of activities. So this is the theory that we're currently testing is, does adding that connect step help the teachers? I'm just going to go over knowledge in pieces really quick because I'm going to show you an ENA map, and I want to make sure that you're going to be able to understand how that fits. So in knowledge in pieces, learning means that you can develop new knowledge resources, you can refine the knowledge resources you have, or you can make connections between resources. And what we've found working with teachers is that first of all, they have a lot of knowledge resources. This notion that teachers don't know things has not borne out in my research. They know lots of things. They don't necessarily always have their knowledge super well connected. And in mathematics, they don't always have structural knowledge. They tend to have problem-solving knowledge. Not always. Some of them do have structural knowledge. It's probably like 60-40. But so they have knowledge resources. So a lot of what we're trying to do in the professional development is help them make connections between those knowledge resources, which we think makes them a better teacher, because that means that when they walk up to a student's work, they're going to be much faster and more able to interpret that student's work than if they don't have those kinds of connections. In order to make claims about knowledge in pieces and what knowledge they have, we use epistemic network analysis, which allows us to actually visualize knowledge resources in the ways that the knowledge resources interact with each other. We can see the relationship between the knowledge resources, and we can see the relative frequency of the knowledge resources. So this will become relevant in just a second, because I'm going to tell you about a noticing that we had. So I had an NSF career grant from like 2010 to 2017, something like that. And in that grant, we were trying to understand, how do teachers understand proportional reasoning? The underlying idea there was, too often when you go into professional development, you start at the very beginning, just like you would with a sixth grader, and the teachers are bored and they find it meaningless because they already know that a ratio is a comparison of two quantities. They already know this stuff. And so we wanted to know, well, what do they know? Because there wasn't a lot in the literature about teacher knowledge of proportions. And we had them doing two different kinds of interviews. One was a think aloud interview, and one was an in-person interview that used interactive technologies. And what we noticed was items that used the same mathematical ideas, that were covering the same mathematical ideas, elicited completely different thinking from them when they did paper and pencil versus when they did it in a dynamic environment. And what we were seeing in the dynamic environment, we thought was way more exciting than what we were seeing on paper and pencil, because in paper and pencil, they would typically just do cross multiplication and move on with their day, which in this particular instance got them a wrong answer every single time. In the dynamic environment, they almost always answered correctly. And we are not so worried about are the answers right or wrong as we are about the processes of thinking, but it was just an interesting thing that we were noticing was happening. So the paper and pencil question that we used is actually from a European group, De Bach and Van Doren and Janssens Verschaffel. They've been doing this work for years and years and years around the what they call linearity, what we would call proportional reasoning in students. And so they create this problem. Bart is a publicity painter. He's painting Santas on windows. He knows how much paint it takes to make one size Santa, how much paint will it take to make another size Santa. Then there's scaffolds that come after this, because we didn't know how teachers would react at first, but students always think that the relationship is 56 to 168. Well, that's 3 times as much, so I'm going to need 18 milliliters of paint. Done. That's great, except that this is an area. This is not a straight line. So you can't say it's 3 times bigger. This is 1/9 the size of this, not 1/3 the size of this. So we created scaffolds. They did the same thing for kids. We created scaffolds that were appropriate for teachers. Ours said things like, Miss Yarbo's class has 2 favorite answers. About 40% of her class says 18 milliliters, and about 40% of her class chooses 54 milliliters. What might the students be thinking who chose each amount? So we provided different scaffolds like this to try to probe teachers into thinking about this as an area. And it was nearly impossible. We had very, very few teachers who actually got to that being an area comparison. In contrast, this is screenshots from our dynamic tool. the bears would start out the same size. You drag this little dot, the bears change size. You can compare the bears to each other. All the teachers just about easily saw that this bear is a quarter of that size. This bear is a ninth of that size. They had no problem with that. They could talk about the relationship of the heights to the heights. They could talk about the relationship of the areas to the areas. Some, though not very many, could talk about the relationship of the width to the height. Some couldn't. But they didn't have any problem with that. The exact same teachers who could not get the Santa problem right for anything. So we started thinking, what is going on here? And that sort of is what led into our professional development. So this is an ENA model, and this is to show how these, it was 32 teachers, practicing classroom teachers, were thinking about these. So Santa rule, the size of the vertex shows the relative frequency of the code. And then these lines show the things it was compared to, and the weight of the line is how frequent that comparison happened. So over here, you'll notice lots of rules, no rules. In this case, rule, I would say probably close to 100% of the time is going to be cross multiplication for this particular problem. And this is only for this problem, by the way, 32 teachers, Santa problem, bear problem. Over here, we had very, very light connections. That means that one or two teachers maybe was making connections. So a lot of them were using the rule, they were using nothing else. Over here, they were pulling on all their knowledge resources to try to make this work. And some of them were pulling on structural resources. They were pulling on ideas about equivalence. They were pulling on ideas about covariation. Those are ideas that are fundamental to how proportions work and not just fundamental to finding answers to proportions. So we not only saw this pulling on more of their understanding, but it pulled on the understandings that we cared more about, because if teachers understand proportions from a structural perspective instead of a problem-solving perspective, our assertion is they're going to be better teachers and they're going to teach their students better, because suddenly math becomes unsiloed. It's not just about, now we're going to learn to solve proportions. Now we're going to learn to solve ratios. Now we're going to learn to solve linear equations. It starts to grow across the fields instead. So out of this noticing, we said, well, if we created PD that used the bears, we would want it to be playful. And James Burke was working with me at the time, and he was doing his dissertation on playfulness. And so it became a natural part of that process to grow this in. And the second theory that we've been working on through design-based research is what our theory of playfulness is. And where we are now is that playfulness requires a discussion-worthy task first. You have to have a task that's worth talking about. And ironically, the thing that makes tasks most worth talking about in mathematics is making them ambiguous. And that's ironic because all we hear in mathematics is how precise it is. You have to be precise. It works better if you're ambiguous in a learning situation. We found, of course, relevant to teaching, we try to give the teachers context that matter to them. We have them analyze supposed students' work, supposed colleagues' work, things like that, instead of saying, solve the problem. They can all solve the problem. They can all get an answer. That's not interesting. What's interesting is, how do you think about it when you have to make sense of somebody else's answer? Because that's also more authentic to the work of teaching. And then either open, middle, or open-ended. So either open-ended means more than one right answer. Open middle means more than one way to get to that right answer. We also think playfulness requires making and testing conjectures, having a supportive learning space where a teacher can say, I don't know. I've never heard this before. If they can't say that, it can't be playful. And they need to have opportunities to develop arguments, reason about those arguments, test, illustrate, explain. It's a very social environment. So some examples of our items. So this is an explore item. We pose a lot of them as mysteries to be solved, or we try to use playful words like that. So mystery, which of any of these shows a proportional relationship? So it always starts out, there's 3 different dynamic screens. Always starts out with this 3 to 5 relationship. You can drag either the blue line or the red line. And as you drag it, a different relationship shows up. And a lot of teachers choose this one because there's a constant difference. And suddenly we have an opportunity to talk about constant and what a constant of proportionality is versus a constant difference. So now we have a chance to dissect this word that they use all the time in a very safe way, where they can kind of get into it. Almost none of them choose this one, which is actually the proportion, because it doesn't do what they think it's going to do, right? They think that a proportion is going to be like this, and it's not, because 3 times 2 is relatively smaller than 3 times 5, or 5 times 2 times 3 and 2 times 5, right? Like they're going to get big at the same multiplicative rate, not at the same length rate. And then this one is an inverse relationship. And this one's a lot of fun because you can always tell in the classroom when they hit it, because they'll be sitting there, testing them out. And when they hit that, they go, because instead of the bars going like this, they go like this. And the teachers are like, what just happened? And then we've got them. So it's the thing, it's the hook that pulls them into the whole thing. Then a connection activity for this is we challenge them. How could we figure out the values if we were using a ratio table, which is a very common representation? How could we do it using the bars? How does using the bars help this? What does finding the values between the whole numbers do? The bars, you can see the numbers between, but you can't get precise because we just have the whole numbers marked. So would it be useful to be able to find those numbers in between to help you see which ones are proportion? And then how does the bars toy compare to other representations in your classroom? These questions are designed explicitly to help them make the connection between this novel thing and the way that they teach math. And then applying to the classroom, I actually took situations that teachers gave me in interviews. I would ask them, what's a word problem for this? And they would give me things like, it's 3 parts fruit juice and 5 parts ginger ale. So whatever recipe you want to do, it's a ratio of 3 to 5. And when I take these into the classroom for PD and I tell the teachers that these are broken word problems, they're like, that's not even a word problem. I'm like, your colleagues gave me that. And it really engages them in thinking about how am I going to teach this to my students? So we've done 2 rounds of research. We had a pilot that was six hours total, 2 hours, 3 days a week back to back, and it was only proportions. And in that we looked at how do we create a playful environment, and can we use a different approach to thinking about that? It goes back to the question about, can we see different ways of thinking by using these dynamic toys with the teachers? And we ran it twice, 2.5 times, in a single school district. We had 3 big ideas at that point: constant, covariate, and quantity. We had 21 teachers, 14 teachers. We videoed the PD session. We got tickets out the door. We did a short satisfaction survey. And we found some interesting things from such a small amount. So we couldn't really measure, did they learn? Because 6 hours isn't really enough to get measurable learning in a traditional, like an assessment kind of way. But teachers loved it. I had a teacher hug me on her way out of the room. That has never happened to me in 20+ years of doing it. She's like, I loved this. I'm like, okay, yay. They had no shared understanding for quantity. And they told us that. We didn't have to guess it. One of the teachers was like, you keep saying quantity, and I don't think I know what you're talking about. And that opened up discussion, and we learned that there's no shared understanding for quantity. We looked across both of the sections. We think that that's probably true. We think that's probably a big hole in math ed literature and in math ed preparation, because we've always thought, I think just assumed, that quantity is quantity. But they did not know what a quantity was. And it became very evident because they were like, so is quantity the numbers? Is quantity the labels? What is this thing? And so we've actually developed, one of my students subsequently did her dissertation on what is quantity. And she's come up with a very elegant definition. It's how much of what measured how. So how much, 30 inches of height measured in inches. It's a nice elegant thing that we can now bring into PD, have conversations with teachers about that. And it moves away from this notion of labeling, which seems artificial, to actually giving that meaning, that it's actually an important part of understanding it's a quantity, because we know that a quantity is a measurable amount, or you can imagine that it's a measurable amount, measurable attribute of something. But saying it's a measurable attribute of something isn't sufficient for teachers. They need a different kind of definition than we use in math ed research. We had a promotion of aha moments. Again, we had a teacher who was like, that was an aha moment for me. I love it when people tell me this. I don't have to guess it was an aha moment. She just told me. It's beautiful. And as I already mentioned, they had issues connecting the content back to the development of tasks. For example, with the bars task, we had them write sample word problems that they might use in their classroom. And they were coming up with amazing examples of linear equations, which is not what you teach in 6th and 7th grade. And they were having great ideas about statistics and just all kinds of things. I'm like, well, that's great, but you don't teach that. So that's what we got with the 6 hours. So we're now going into our second year of the second round of research, which is 30 hours, 5 days, 6 hours a day. Last summer, we did 2 implementations, one with 8 teachers, one with 14 teachers. We've moved up to 5 big ideas because we've brought fractions into it. So we still have quantity, covariate, and constant, but we've also added referent unit, which is what is your one when you're talking about a fraction, and invariance. I don't know why we did covariation without invariance to start with, but we did. And now we've properly brought invariance back in because a lot of times you talk about those together. We're doing the same basic idea. We take multiple video cameras in, we do tickets out the door, we have a short satisfaction survey. A couple weeks later, we do a longer satisfaction survey. And now we're working with the psychometricians at UGA to do topic modeling on whole class data. They usually do topic modeling on smaller bodies of data, like individual speakers. And so this is a step forward in psychometric research as well, as they try to figure out how can we use this method to measure classroom conversations. We thought that was really important though, because if we're having a playful environment for teaching, it seemed completely wrong to give them a paper and pencil test at the end. Okay, you had lots of fun, here's your test. So we wanted to keep the assessment embedded in the PD in a way that was authentic to what they were already doing. And so if the topic modeling thing ends up working, which fingers crossed it will, we will have found a completely different way to do assessment that relies on computers doing the work so that the teacher can keep moving forward and not have to stop and test constantly. Oh, topic modeling, if you haven't heard of it, looks for commonalities in words. So it's looking for individual words. This is part of the thing that is making this very difficult, because we teach math in a way that's not traditional. And so lots of different things, lots of different words could have the same basic meaning. And so that's sort of where we are right now, is defining what words have the same meaning for the purposes of topic modeling. But it clusters people into different groups. In a recent science ed example they were working with middle school students, and what they found was one grouping of words wasn't really about science at all. One group of words was about science, but it was very informal language, and one grouping of words was more formal science language. And so what you would hope is to see over time more students move into that grouping of words that's the more formal science language. And the groupings of words emerge out of the data in the first place. So it's not like you're taking a set of codes and applying it and saying, I'm going to see how many times the students say this word I think is important. It's saying on day 1, this is the language that they used. On day 2, this is the language they used. And so learning in that case means changing groups. As I mentioned already, we're doing 2 different conditions. I'm using that word loosely because it's clearly mostly qualitative. We're using connections as discussion, connections as reflections. We have 3 different people who teach the course. I taught last summer, and one of somebody who I knew from UGA taught the course. But it was interesting because Rachel and I have been doing this work together for about 15 years. And we think about fractions and proportions all the time and have been thinking about fractions and proportions for 15 years. Eileen, who you will see in a video shortly, is very strong mathematically, comes from the same kinds of thinking traditions that we come from, but she has a different set of things that she has focused on. And so watching her teach our materials was super interesting to see what she focused on versus where we had thought it was going to be focused on, which is sort of helping us as we're thinking about the next step, which the next step would be scalability. And so working with Eileen has been a really nice test in how does it scale to somebody who's like us? And then the next question would be, how is it scaled to somebody who's maybe not like us, who hasn't spent all these years working together? Oh, let me go back if I can. There we go. So we're still analyzing. We know for sure teachers still love it. They engage in it playfully. There's lots of laughter. They engage, the tasks are engaging to them. The technology supports learning rather than showing the answer. That's been a huge driver of ours from the very beginning. The technology representations in general, but particularly the technology needs to support their thinking, not show us the answer. And when I walk up to a teacher and she's drawn the answer out and I'm like, how did you get that? And she's like, well, I calculated it over here and I drew it over here. My next thing to her is, now try working it with that instead of drawing it. And it's really hard for teachers to do that. So the video I'm going to show you, just so that you can see a little bit of what this PD looks like now that I've told you all probably way too much detail about the back end of it. We want them, there's a dynamic environment called fraction bars that's freely available. If you want to go check it out, it's on the web. We were trying to get them to do a couple of things. One was to get comfortable using fraction bars, but another was to start thinking about what's happening when we multiply fractions. So this was a very carefully chosen set of problems that we could have them look at patterns across to make sense of what's happening in the representation as they're solving it. We're also trying to help them think about what the relationship between an array, which is how we talk about area models when we're using them with young children teaching them multiplication, relates to an area model, which is what we call it when it moves into fraction world. So that's why there's whole number, fraction times whole number, unit fractions, and then unit times a non-unit fraction. So hopefully this will work. So you can hear our PD is very noisy. The teachers are 100% engaged, but it uncovers mathematical understandings that we didn't necessarily know. Like in both of our sites last summer, we found out that teachers don't actually know how to make sense out of area models for fractions, which is a really big deal because that's in their standards. This is what they teach. They know how to make it look right. That's not a problem. Like I said, teachers can get answers. Getting answers is not a problem. They can do that, but they don't know what it's showing them once it gets the answer. So they don't understand that when you multiply, I think it was 1/3 times 1/6, what you're doing is taking 1/6 of 1/3, which means that your referent unit has changed for that 6. So your third is of the whole bar, 1/6 is of the 1/3, but then you express the answer back out as a part of a whole, which is part of why fraction multiplication division is really tricky because the referent units are changing. So that was one of the things that we learned that we didn't realize before that becomes really important when you're teaching teachers. Just because they can generate a right answer doesn't mean they actually have a conceptual understanding of what they're doing. And I think that this kind of playful engagement pushes us deeper in that direction. So going back to my opening about how I think this helps us understand computer science education is I think that there's a huge parallel between the common experience for teachers in mathematics and the common experience for teachers in computer science. There's too much focus on technology rather than learning. If you have reviewed journal articles for very long in journals that deal with technology, you have gotten so many that have the question, can iPads improve mathematics practice? Like, can pencils improve writing? I don't know. Depends on what you do with it. It's not the technology. We focus way too much on the technology. And I think in computer science, they do too. They spend a lot of time on coding and not as much time on thinking about problem solving. Too much focus on skills rather than concepts. In math, teachers will drill kids to death. And they get, like, by the time you get to middle school, teachers will complain all day long about the students who can't do their times tables. Well, you know what? If a kid can't do their times tables by the time they're in 6th grade, they're not going to learn them. They either are incapable of it or they're not inspired to. It's not going to happen. Give them a calculator. Let's move on. Maybe they'll pick it up on their own. But from a school perspective, there's nothing that teacher's going to do to motivate them to learn their times tables that they didn't try in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade before that. And by the way, kids with dyscalculia, which is a pretty big percent of children, can't memorize their times tables. Their brains just don't work that way. I've worked with a kid who had dyscalculia. She would memorize her timetables, and in the middle of it, her face would go totally blank, and it would be like she had never mathed before in her life. So just drilling times tables is not going to get you there. Too much focus on what to know rather than how to be. One of our driving interests here is to let teachers experience the world of being a mathematician. Mathematicians don't sit down and solve a page of workbook problems. None of them do. They think about problems, they argue about problems, they make conjectures and test conjectures. We want to engage teachers in legitimate peripheral participation, right? We want them to have experiences that are like what a mathematician does, and we want them to take those experiences back into their classroom. The same thing happens with computer science. We focus on, can these kids program in X, Y, or Z language, and not enough on what does an actual computer scientist do day to day? I live with a programmer, and I can tell you when he's complaining, it's almost never about the code. It's about interfacing with people. It's about solving hard problems. It's about getting pieces of the program to work together that weren't made at the same time. Those are the kinds of problems they're solving. If he has a problem with the code, he goes to GitHub and he finds help. Too much focus on what rather than how. We focus a lot on what content kids should know, whether it's in computer science or math. The content they should know is all this stuff. We don't focus a whole lot on how. Again, in the research we do, but not in the classrooms. I think math ed has a very long history of focusing on how that has never made it out to the average teacher, which is part of why I do what I do now. And then too much focus on tools rather than the context in which they're used. We focus too much on iPads and not enough on what is it like to be a teacher with a cart full of iPads and 25 kids and those iPads are dead because the last teacher didn't plug it in, right? We need to think about the context in which they're used. We need to think about the context of problems. We need to think about the context of the technology and quit thinking about, did the kids get X number of minutes with this tool this week? Well, let's think about what kind of math experience did they have? What kind of programming experience did they have? What kind of computational thinking experience did they have? So hopefully that gives you something to think about moving beyond access, because COVID pretty much gave everybody access, at least for the moment, to technology. Now it's what are we going to do with it? And that I will wrap up and open up for questions. And I will also say, if you want to know more about the design of our PD, we have a chapter in the most recent International Compendium.
Thank you, Chandra. Right on time, we actually have 15 minutes for questions.
That's what I was hoping.
So, floor is open.
Very math ed question.
Uh-huh.
But if someone has a more general question.
No, I was gonna ask a math ed question.
Go for it.
So I'm curious in the professional development, how you worked with teachers on the area model. And whether or not, I think one thing that is confusing for teachers about the model is where the fractions are represented and what each of them represent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rare for teachers to think that they represent like a linear measure.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like an action on the area.
Yep.
So I'm curious, how did you treat it in the professional development, and how are the teachers interpreting it? What were they coming in with, since it is a standard that they teach? So
Yeah, so part of what we do, I think that this question may be the one that you saw the video for might be the first thing that we actually have them do, because after that they move into, we sort of take a step back into arrays. And so this is sort of where we feel out, what do they know? What do they do? So we're like, area models. Let me show you how to use fraction bars, because that'll be for the teachers who really don't know area models. Like in the class I taught last summer, we had a third grade teacher, which was kind of an anomaly. She did not know area models, which is fair. That's not what she does. So in the process of showing them how fraction bars works, we also kind of are like, see, you can break it into thirds, and look, you can break that third into fifths. And now look, you have a third times a fifth so we sort of do that much. And then we let them go with with that question and see how much are they able to fill in for themselves, and then use that to guide the kinds of questions and discussions we have with them. I didn't focus on the role of the instructor here. The role on the professional developer is heavy.
she has a nice advanced question.
Yeah.
And assessing question.
Yeah.
I was curious about the bears and the Santas and just more about the different affordances, because obviously one of those dynamic, you can slide it, you can see that change, and
Yep.
visually it kind of highlights that area is changing as well as these other dimensions. But then another difference I noticed is that the bears had kind of that rectangular outline, whereas the Santa shape was irregular. And I know from working with kids, the opportunities to check area by tiling, for example, it's easier with rectangular shapes than with others. So I was just curious about those different affordances and how just how those things came out, even in the future PD that you were working on.
So with the Santa problem, we actually, one of the extra prompts we give them is, do you think it would be helpful for your students to draw a rectangle around Santa? And most teachers are like, no. And when they get to the bears, it's totally natural. They never question it. They're like, oh, there's a rectangle. Let's use the rectangle. So there's a huge disconnect in the ways that they think about it. And I'm sure part of it is because you can see it changing, and that's part of what we didn't expect. I had actually never even thought about it, right? Like I didn't think about the fact that they were going to interact differently at a cognitive level with the technology. I just thought it was going to give us something new to talk about. But it turns out, and I think one of the things I was actually curious about was, do they think that a proportion is every instance while they're pulling the slider across, or do they think it's only when they stop? And I think that's sort of one of the places that question came out of in the first place. And a surprising number of teachers believe that proportion only exists when you stop. They don't think it's all the minutes in between, which is sort of an interesting thing too. But yeah, that's one of the things that drove us to want to do this PD was when we did the pilot. We haven't done this with the full version, but with the pilot, we actually asked them a Santa-like question. It was about a tree logo. And most of the people at the end of the PD, after spending 6 hours with these dynamic environments, answered the tree problem completely wrong, just like they had before they went in there. So whatever's happening on the computer is not connected in their heads to what's happening on the paper at all, which I find just fascinating. I just get in there and I'm like, this is so cool. Yes.
Yeah, kind of along the same lines, like, I'm sure a lot of us, when you put up that problem, I started trying to solve it in my head,
Mhm.
like. And with the background in physics, I don't know how many times I've drilled into my students that we have these areas we're working with and you can't ratio like that on this
Mhm.
problem. But yet my impulse was to do it wrong.
Yep.
It was tempting to overzealously apply
Yep.
that rule. So I didn't notice, but was there a temptation there to overzealously apply rules on this teddy bear?
No rules at all.
Okay.
No numbers at all. No cross multiplication at all. Which was one of the things that we found so fascinating. The thing that they went to first with Santa, they never went to with the teddy bear.
Well, I mean, with the prompt that was given them.
Oh, we didn't ask them. We asked them to talk about what they meant when we'd say how much bigger is the bear that's resizing, how much bigger is that bear than the other bear? And, they would say, most of them would use just a height measurement. So they'd say 3 times bigger, 2 times bigger, whatever. And we'd be like, well, what do you mean by bigger here? Because we were trying to dig into when a teacher says 5 times bigger, are they talking, what are they looking at to mean 5 times bigger? Because again, that was all just about how do teachers understand proportions. We weren't trying to teach anything in that. Yeah, and I will say, if this was a room that was all math educators, we would have stopped and solved Santa.
Chandra, can you go back to the play part where you theorize play?
Mhm.
Where are these dimensions of playfulness coming?
Are you talking about like from the literature or?
Mhm.
Yeah, so a lot of it is coming out of work from Brunner and Vygotsky. And then part of it is coming from our research. So like we started with discussion worthy tasks and we started really pushing on what do we mean by discussion worthy tasks? And why do we think that that's working? But the safe environment came out of the literature. The kinds of, obviously Vygotsky and Brunner weren't saying make and test conjectures, but that kind of thinking is coming out of them. The problem that James ran into in his dissertation was that there's just not a lot of literature about playfulness for adults. And we've even gotten back, when we've sent away journal articles, we've gotten back feedback saying, why would you make this playful for adults? They've already bought in. So the notion of play for adults is largely under theorized at the moment.
Do you remember Enid Zimmerman? Her son grew up to be a play theorist.
Oh, wow.
So if you look up Eric Zimmerman, you might find,
Mhm.
and it's all in the gaming arena, and there's that slippery slope toward gamification, which you will avoid, like play.
Yes.
Sure. But doing this with studio education,
Mhm.
which has this big playful dimension, is
Right.
where I found that stuff. And
Mhm.
they don't stop with kids, or they don't focus specifically on kids because the play in the game world spans the
Right.
generations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's interesting because in math ed, most of the people doing research on play are doing it with kids. And yeah, the first time we got back that feedback, why would you make this playful for adults? We were like, why wouldn't you make it playful for adults? It's a no-brainer. Just because you're bought in doesn't mean you don't want to have fun.
And so your measure of playfulness is their enjoyment.
Their enjoyment and their engagement.
Mhm.
We measure it a lot in engagement. We measure it a lot in their enthusiasm, their persistence. In one of the pilots, I was telling the group this morning, in one of our pilots, we had this group of 4 ladies who was in the back of the room. They're like, no, I can't believe you, not that way, do it that way. It's like, you can't even hear the rest of our video because these 4 ladies are just like screaming at each other and having the best time. And they're doing math. I mean, it's proportions. They're not doing anything bigger than proportions. So we were like, I think this is playful. This counts. Yes.
So could you talk about the non-tenure track, tenure track, and being out of academia? The majority of folks who I think are
Yeah.
grad students, and there may be others who are still wondering what they want to be when they grow up. So even if they are on tenure track, so.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, I've wondered what I was gonna be when I grow up too, so. So I started, well, I spent a year at Ohio University as a tenure track faculty member, but the position wasn't a good fit for me for a variety of reasons that are boring. And I moved to UGA, a non-tenure track. And non-tenure track is a lot of fun in that you get to do what you want to do. So you get to get up, like I identify as a researcher before being a teacher. I love teaching. I particularly love doing professional development, but I am a researcher first. That's just my identity. So I could do any research I wanted. I just had to fund it. And that was fine, except that what I realized once I got successful at funding it was once you get $1 million grant, then you need to get another $1 million grant, another $1 million grant, another $1 million grant, so that you can keep your lab going. Because it wasn't just me, it was me plus, 3 to 12 students, plus I had a full-time person. And so it's a lot of chasing money. And so I wanted to go on the tenure track because I thought that would make it a different experience. I would still be able to work with the students. I would still be able to do all of those kinds of things, but I wouldn't have to chase the money. And I joined UMass Dartmouth when Stephen Hegedus and Maria Blanton were there. I was hired to help start the PhD program in math ed, which is now a PhD program in STEM education. And I was super excited because Stephen and Maria are very experienced grant writers. They had lots of grants. I was like, this is great. They'll get some grants. I'll get some grants. This will be great. They quit. And that left me. And I was like, we have this doctoral program and we have me. So I had to start chasing the grants again. So because as many of you in this room know, the way that you go through grad school is that your faculty member gets grants that pay for you to go through grad school. So if you want to build a doctoral program, some buddies need to be writing grants. So I did, I went through the whole thing and, I did assistant associate, full, I've been department chair, I was a center director. I had all the fun that really a person could possibly have in academia. And I decided that I was really way past the culture of academia because it's incredibly political and it was getting in the way of getting things done. And so I just wanted to focus on making a difference because I felt like in academia, I was making less of a difference, or as a tenure line professor, I was making less of a difference than I felt like I was making as a non-tenure track professor. When I was a non-tenure track professor, I was out in the schools constantly. Amy Hackenberg worked with me for a while. Eric worked on a project, not under me, but with me on CoStar. Eric worked with me for a while. And so I was having these great, rich conversations and experiences with really smart grad students. And it was sort of like the best of both worlds, except that it was that treadmill. And yeah, so the tenure line is nice because you know exactly more or less what the expectations are. If you meet the expectations, you can do it and you can make a life. And I had a colleague at UMass Dartmouth who I think is like a superhero because he's like, this is my life at work. This is my life at home. The two will not touch. And he's the only person I know who can draw boundaries like that. And I think if you can do that, then you can really thrive in academia. But I'm not like that. So everything just kind of does this and blurs together.
If I were a grad student sitting here today.
Yeah.
I would hear you saying, leap from here to where you are now. And what do you think about that part of your trajectory? Could you have done that?
No. For a few reasons. One is obviously the content, because I graduated here from IST and I changed to be in math. I do not recommend that. People have asked me, no, I recommend that you get a
She's not saying
degree.
she doesn't recommend our degree.
No, no, no. In the field that you intend to be in, which I did. And then I fell in love with math ed and there you go. But everything that I learned in IST, I still use. I don't regret going through IST at all. My dissertation was on teacher professional development and problem solving situations. So I mean, it wasn't math problem solving, it was, like real world problem solving, but I don't have a problem at all with my background. But I do recommend, if you can, get your PhD in the field you want to go into so that you don't have to spend the next, 20 years figuring out how to work in another field. And there was a lot of stuff to learn. Like, I've learned how to write grants by writing grants and serving on grant review panels, so many grant review panels. They're so useful. Anytime you have a chance to review journal articles, do it. That's how you learn to write. Anytime you have a chance to review grants, do it. That's how you learn to write a grant. Because as you're writing your own feedback, you're like, oh, wait, this applies to me too. So it's having all of those experiences in between. So yeah, you have to live the whole life, which is kind of a bummer. I've also had to learn a lot about people. I am a natural introvert. If I could not confront people, that would be fantastic. And then I was a department chair, and now I'm like, if something's wrong, I'm like, this is wrong. We need to fix it. So yeah, I think, find your strengths and work towards those, but don't run away from your weaknesses. Keep building those, because they're gonna, 20 years from now, you'll be me. Not me, but next to me. Does that help?
Well, we are out of time. So Chandra, thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
And